next and final speaker for this session is Dr. John Soluri, and John is in the history department at Carnegie Mellon University, and he described himself as a former shadow student, both undergraduate and graduate student here with John. So, John, and the title of his talk is Academia's Matrix, Migration, Mutations, and Mutts.
Thanks to Yvette, and thanks to everybody. Just a couple caveats. First of all, this this is a tough group to follow and to conclude with. So this is those of you who want to get some coffee. I think the high point of this session, frankly, has passed. And I'm particularly grateful, though, for the comments of both of Hilda and Joseph in particular, because as a historian, I actually spent a lot of time thinking about the so-called holy trinity of race, class, and gender. Although actually today I'm going to, in some ways, maybe somewhat oddly, talk a little bit more about some of John's maybe more theoretical stuff. I'm no mathematician, but I want to think about agroecology and interdisciplinarity. So in some ways, I'm going to take a sort of maybe a little bit internalist to sort of insider baseball of academia, but I do think there are many ways that academia can both help science, can help to both break barriers and expose myths about race and gender and class, but it also can create its own kind of internal barriers and disciplines and policing. Two brief stories about John and Yvette. I should clarify one. I actually did my undergrad here as well as my graduate work, so I'm sort of an 80s, 90s guy. But Yvette, technically, if you go and if a historian were to dig back, was bored enough to figure out what Soluri was doing in the 80s and the 90s, they'd say actually Yvette was, in fact, technically my advisor. So I have to so I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge in some ways, moreover, John's willingness to sort of be a shadow advisor in a sense for many, many years, from really my undergraduate through graduate and really still today. So you don't necessarily always see the citations as much as they should be, but I just want to publicly acknowledge that. And two brief anecdotes about John and Yvette, and actually and many people here. The first one, and this is just John, I don't know if everyone, but there's one point when I think it was in grad school, and I walked into John's lab, and I don't know if he still has the same lab, but I was in like sort of the room, the initial room, and his office was kind of recessed, I think off to kind of the right. And I overheard him saying something like, "Don't tell Soluri I said this, but fucking historians know everything." And so the first thing, I'm going to confess, John, I heard that remark, but it's actually bullshit because we definitely don't know everything. I think there's very little that we know. So you're wrong. It's the only thing you maybe have been wrong about. But then the second thing, and this is really the more sort of serious and heartfelt thing, was when I came back. I wrote my dissertation in absentia, and I came back for my defense. And it was somewhat socially disconnected from, frankly, a lot of my peers by that point. And so when I had my defense, I came in. I was sort of the typical hippie. I didn't really care about my defense that much as a formal thing. But I came into the room, and the room was like filled, at least my memories, was filled with people. And they were not history graduate students. They were actually some of the people in this room. They were new Aggies, basically. And my advisor in history actually remarked, she looked around, she's like, wow, it's nice to see, there's a sense of community somewhere in this university. And I think that sense of community within university, I mean, John and Yvette have done a lot about building communities beyond the university. I know that's obviously central to the interests of many people in this room. But I do think, right, the work, those of us who are academics or at least went through this academic process, right, the communities, it's foundational in many ways, right? Not just what we learn sort of intellectually, but the social relationships we form, the possibilities of social relationships are hugely important. So again, thanks to both John and Yvette for that. Okay, I'll try to stay on time here. Keep me on time, Yvette. All right, since the late 20th century, I would say this notion of interdisciplinary research has been upheld in some ways as the holy grail of scholarly activities in many major US universities and professionalized research centers. However, I think there continue to be many, in my own experience as a historian at Carnegie Mellon, I think there's many organizational / structural, epistemological, and social barriers that impede scholars from migrating across disciplinary and social boundaries. And here's where I want to sort of use this metaphor, migration. I want to argue that the term migrant is a potent metaphor for challenging notions of purity. In this case, I'm talking more about intellectual purity than some other kinds of purity which are often invoked. let me see if I can actually get the slide to advance. Okay, so this is just a goofy thing I frankly pull off the web. But I think this is kind of typical of the kinds of things that go on where we have these neatly defined disciplines, right? And I was going to do, if you want to go to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is one of my favorite things to play around with, it's interesting to think about the notion of discipline and the meanings of that. Because needless to say, the initial several meanings of discipline are not about history, science, or biology and chemistry, but about a whole bunch of other things that many of us would probably strongly object to, actually, in terms of the notions of discipline. So what I want to, but I'm not going to linger on that, but what I want to actually instead talk about is what I'm grateful for, is what I'm going to call the Michigan matrix, and in which, I was going to try to talk about Michigan matrix if it comes back. The idea here is is that again, what I think is important and somewhat rare that John and Yvette and the folks in this room have been able to help create is precisely the kinds of spaces for interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary work, and for people to sort of migrate in and out. So whether it's Ed Russell, when I was actually thinking about these remarks, I wasn't sure if people like Ed and Angus were going to be here, but those of us who are sort of card-carrying PhDs in history, and yet we sort of found a space, right, to come in and sometimes go out of, right, come in and go out of agroecology and sort of the interface of science, in this case, and humanities. So let's see if I can, actually my slides are also my notes, so I'm going to be somewhat reveal how flimsy the depth of my knowledge is on this talk today. So what I decided to do, though, was I thought, because I also remember giving a couple of presentations with Newag folks, and they kind of like said, wow, the Soluri is just kind of weird historians, like they don't have graphs, they don't have data. So I actually did pull up some data, because one of the things I wanted to do is, so on the one hand, I think probably most of the people here are evident and aware of the abilities, and also probably some of the challenges, right, to truly forge and put in practice, right, interdisciplinary academic approaches and research approaches, and teaching, too. But then it got me kind of curious to know about the notion of agroecology, which is a term that I embraced and actually integrated into agroecology, is actually in the title of my dissertation. And so then I got curious about, well, what's happening with agroecology, as a term, in a sense, as a concept? Is it in fact migrating out of the sciences, out of the closely allied biological science, ecology in particular, to other sciences, including the social sciences? So to that end, what I did, all right, okay, here we go. We can just, actually, that's the beauty about this research is, and the beauty about this experiment is it's very simple. This is a great thing about junk science, because it's all replicable. You guys can go, when you get tired of reading Facebook posts or looking for bargains, don't press that, okay. Or looking at, now you tell me. Anyway, looking for bargains on the REI outlet, you can go to a database like ProQuest, and in this case, I used the dissertations and theses database, and it had a search term, which my initial search was using agroeco, and because I wanted to capture different forms of agroecology. And I initially did this anywhere except full text, and I'll come back to that. So what I came up with, so this is going to be titles, subjects, keywords, things like that. And I came up with an N of about 772 classifications, right? Now these are not going to add up to 772 because people can do multiple ones. But the top 10, perhaps not surprising, right? Ecology was number 1, agronomy was number 2, entomology number 3, environmental science is obviously a very broad category, number 4. But then what I was, as a humanist, but obviously something sort of closer, arguably, to fields like geography and culture and anthropology, I particularly was curious to know to what extent this term was being picked up. So, and I see, again, so I wasn't really shocked by this, but I thought it was kind of interesting to see that, yes, there's clearly some evidence that this term, agroecology, anyway, or agroecosystems, is sort of migrating, particularly into geography and culture and anthropology, which didn't totally surprise me, but I thought it was interesting. If we think about our sort of metapopulation change over time, and this maybe some of you may, again, not be surprised by, but not know, this would probably parallel a lot of John's career here and others. according to this, again, this database, there were only 7 theses or dissertations published that had this term agroecology or something like that in the 70s, massive increase in the 80s, big increase in also significant increase in the 90s, then you see it starts to sort of level off a little bit. In parentheses here, this is ecology, okay, there's the discipline of people who got PhDs or theses in ecology, and you can see it rough correspondence there. Now in the social sciences, with what I grouped together, what I mean by that here is I grouped economics, geography, and culture, anthropology. These were the most common ones, social sciences that came up. 133, and actually you see a fairly similar pattern. I don't think there are any, apparently none in the 70s, but you start to see some of the 80s, big increase in the 90s, and then a little bit of a leveling off more recently. History, discipline of many of us here, remains certainly not terribly common. From 1987 through 2014, only 16 using the term. Now, needless to say, some of you are probably already thinking about, there are many limitations to this methodology. One of the things is certainly many of you in this room, in fact, I was struck by when I then put in Michigan, because I wanted to see, well, how many, actually what I really wanted to do is compare John and Yvette, but I decided I'm going to do that. So I did do that. I'll tell you about the good results of that later. But anyway, but this term only obviously is going to capture a subset of even the researchers in this room, because I only came up with U of M theses with 15, and many people in this room I know their names didn't even come up. Many did, but many did not. So clearly there's some serious limitations to this, but I just mentioned this. Now, this is another, I said, well, all right, let's look full text, let's just go crazy and see what's out there. And maybe in some ways this is a better measure of how agroecology or agroecosystem is sort of migrating and becoming more of a term that in a sense it doesn't have to be featured, right, as a title. It's something more that people are using, right, as the way you might use biology or the way you might use gender or class, something that in a sense doesn't really necessarily need as much explanation. Here there's almost 9,000 hits, or speaker came up with. Again, you see a fairly familiar pattern, not a lot of shift, right, in the fields where it dominates, ecology, agronomy, culture and anthropology actually gets knocked down a little bit with forestry, and biogeochemistry come in, econ and geography still featured fairly prominently. And I think I did a rough sort of calculation. If you look sort of proportionally, say, in other words, the relationship to, say, ecology and geography, if you just look at it this way in terms of and using the term of the text, the relative distance between the two narrows, if that makes sense. I'm not explaining that clearly. But it's not significant. I don't think it's significantly different. But there is a little sign anyway that, that agroecology, at the end of the day, I think is migrating a bit some other fields. And history, again, we can see definitely the term, there has been some cross-disciplinary migration. Okay, now that said, I think there's still obviously a lot more work to be done. I'm not really here to give a long talk about, I think we could have a conversation obviously about the things that, how one goes about creating and maintaining. Actually, one of our former graduate students at Carnegie Mellon has just formed a group about the maintainers, and they're really trying to call attention not just to innovation, but actually maintenance, and that actually a lot of the work of life, right, whether it's science or society, is actually who are the maintainers? The people who maintain systems. And one of the things I was commenting with Patrick Christie that I think is impressive about John and Yvette is the sustainability of the system, the ability to kind of reproduce it, to keep creating these communities of multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary scholars that are not so concerned about purity, but are more interested in migrations and movements. And the one thing I was just going to say, just to extend this sort of problematic metaphor a little bit, is I think there are some real risks here, right? Because the thing is, when you give up, and I find this in my own department in 15 years in a history department, people get real concerned when you start talking about, let's hire an anthropologist. But seemingly, and that's why I say, part of me, after especially hearing the talks that just went by, he talks about, let's hire an anthropologist in our history department. And the debates that, get created over, hiring anthropologists, you think I was suggesting, again, like, let's reimpose segregation or something. I mean, it's absurd. It's like, this is ridiculous. We're talking about an anthropologist coming to a history department. And I think that kind of internal self-policing is something that's still very real and alive in departments. And I think it's something that needs to be really thought about and talked about a lot. And I think, because I think we do need a richer matrix, and we need to acknowledge that ultimately we have the notion of a university, which is very so idealistic, but that we really have these subpopulations that spend a lot of time talking to each other and reproducing themselves, which is great, but they're not necessarily working, cross. There's not as much cross-fertilization as we had in the maze that I first hit up on the thing. Now let me end with this. A question for you guys will be a little bit interactive. All right, so then I said, well, let's go to every radical's favorite whipping human. I won't gender it, or whipping thing. Let's dehumanize it. Whipping institution. That's better. The New York Times. ProQuest. We all love ProQuest, right? Historical newspapers, New York Times. How many hits for agroeco? 1984 to 2008. Anybody want to give me an order of magnitude even? 3. 10? 10? All right. I think most of you guys are on the right track. The results are 4. And yeah, 4. And I kind of double checked that. I couldn't quite believe it was that few, so I sort of checked. Yeah, I came up with basically 4, and even less if you just use agroecology. Now, on the one hand, I actually was thinking, reflecting on this a little bit, and I'll end with, let's get rid of that. We'll end with this image. I was thinking about it. Again, I'm not trying to say, in some ways you could say, who cares about the New York Times? And maybe it's a good thing, right? That at the end of the day, New York Times hasn't embraced this term because maybe it means it's still. It'd be more important to do this study to see, how many campesinos are finding this such a useful term, or how many, community organizers are finding this useful term or not, because that may mean it is both a potent term in the world of science, the realm of science and other disciplines, but also potent to be oppositional and challenging, more, whatever you want to call it, mainstream politics or more reactionary politics. But I do think, and I end with this image, which is not, you can leave this up to you to how you want to interpret this, but I do think that here I'm talking more, we've talked a lot in this session about different kinds of barriers, but I do think that, well, it's easy target for us as academics to talk about, say, the corporatization of universities and talk about administration. Again, just speaking mostly from my own experience, both positively and sometimes negatively, I think there's a lot of self-policing, right, that goes on, and internalization of ideas about who we are as scholars, as people, that's based not only on race, class, and gender, but also the theories we subscribe to and how we organize our thoughts. And I'll end by congratulating again John, Yvette, and everybody here for throughout the years helping push me to not, to try to constantly ask myself, like, to what extent I need to break out of this disciplinary binds. That they're useful, but they're also, as the word suggests, very constraining. That we need to constantly be working to be migrants. So I just want to encourage everybody to be intellectual migrants and really reject purity, which, as we've just seen, doesn't really exist anyway. So it's easy to be a migrant in that framework. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Oh.